Podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered a Podcast, we're going to be diving into the case of Mandy Stavik. But unfortunately, this is going to be a pretty short episode, and I've also broken this case up into 2 parts. But I did it for a really good reason, if that helps. There has been a lot of movement and a lot of updates and even some recent news coverage of the Aisha Degree case. And if you know anything about me and anything about that case, then you know that the Aisha Degree case is one of the cases that formed who I am as a person. That case happened extremely close to my hometown, and we were roughly the same age, which just kind of made it hit a little closer to home than a lot of these cases do. This was a case that I heard about growing up. Every adult that I was around was always talking about this case, and it just kind of stuck with me. It stuck with a lot of people in our hometown. So, to see a little bit of movement or any movement at all in this 24-year-old case, I am off the walls ecstatic. I plan to go down the biggest rabbit hole on this case, and I've covered it briefly on a Patreon episode, but I'm thinking it's time to do it some justice. Especially if we're going to finally see justice and have answers. And there's also just been a lot going on in day-to-day life. I've been at the doctor with both of my kids, it seems like all week long. My grandma's been in the hospital for over a week now. It's just been a crazy few weeks. I was kind of hoping that once school started back, we would get back on like a more leveled out, evened out schedule. And I'm sure we'll get there, but it's just not this week, unfortunately. And that would also explain why Patreon did not get their episode last Friday either. I ended up at urgent care last Friday doing x-rays on both of my youngest son's legs because he was convinced they were broken. And who am I to tell him that they're not, because the last time he broke his arms, both of them, he walked around for a week without knowing they were broke. So I'll never do that again. I immediately took him to have him x-rayed. And my oldest son was at the urgent care with a skin abscess that desperately needs to be lanced, but he just wanted to try antibiotics first because he's 12 and doesn't want to be cut open. And I'm also just still trying to keep my fish alive without letting my dog be super jealous. It's fine. It's all the things, but we're getting past it. We're going to get through it. It's not a big deal. We'll be back to normal before you know it, hopefully, for my sake and yours. So this week, we are jumping into Mandy Stavik, but I really need to get down this rabbit hole of Aisha Degree, so I broke it into 2 sections that are just going to be probably 30 minutes each, this week and next week. And again, I'm sorry about that, but with all that being said and without further ado, let's get it. Amanda Teresa Stavik was better known by her nickname Mandy, and she was born to her parents Glenn and Mary Stavik on April 16th in 1971 in Anchorage, Alaska. Mandy was one of the couple's 4 kids, but by the time that Mandy was 3 years old, her parents decided that it was time to split and go their separate ways in 1974. Now, it was after this divorce that the Stavik family would go through one tragedy after the next, after the next, after the next. And this would kind of become a cycle for this family, unfortunately. Because at just 17 years old, Mandy's brother Brent was shot to death multiple times in the head and chest in 1975. So, Mandy's parents get divorced in 1974, and then the very next year, in 1975, her brother is shot and killed. And from what I could find, there still hasn't been anyone brought to justice for the murder of Mandy's brother Brent. But the next big Stavik family tragedy happened in 1988, so a little after 13 years since Mandy's brother had been shot and killed. But it was 13 years after her brother was shot and killed that Mandy's stepbrother Spencer, who was the son of Mandy's dad's second wife, Mandy's stepbrother Spencer also passed away in a boating accident when he was just 20 years old. So, like I said, this family took one blow after the next, and eventually, after the loss of her son, Mary's mom decided that it would be a good time to just kind of start fresh in 1983. She packed things up and she moved the family from Alaska to Acme, Washington, which at the time only had a population of, I believe it said, about 200 people. So, a super, super, super small town. But Mandy and her family settled in Acme, Washington, and this is where Mandy thrived. She was confident and brilliant and beautiful, and she knew exactly what she wanted out of life. Mandy was a literal superstar for her high school sports teams, where she not only played softball and basketball, but she also ran track and cross country along with being a cheerleader. So, needless to say, Mandy was super athletic and driven, and she was devoted to the sports that she played, but she was also really devoted about her schooling. And she was actually so devoted to her schooling that she managed to stay on the honor roll for damn near her entire time at Mount Baker High School. And Mandy didn't just run for track and cross country at school, though. She was like an avid runner. She regularly took runs along the streets nearby where she lived. Running was something that Mandy did often, and she loved it. Now, eventually, Mandy found work as a part-time daycare worker at the YMCA, where she also trained as a lifeguard. Mandy had plenty of friends, and she even had a boyfriend named Rick Zender. She was ready to take on the world, and she was ready to start this new chapter of her life. So, from what everyone says and the way that people talk about Mandy, it seems like she was incredible. And she definitely had her shit together. She was going places, and everybody knew it. And especially when you consider the fact that she was still just a teenager, she was basically killing it. Now, once she finished high school, Mandy enrolled in Central Washington University in the fall of 1989 to start her major in nutrition. Mandy just seemed like she was already such a well-rounded teen that she would have been like a thriving adult who could have done so much good for the world had she not been taken so soon. And once Mandy started classes at Central Washington University, she was still just crushing it. But before long, it was Thanksgiving break, and the campus would be closed for the holiday. Mandy had kind of planned just to head back to Acme, Washington, where the rest of her family was, and she was just going to spend the holidays with them, hang out with some friends that she hadn't seen in a while, and just kind of catch up with everybody from her small town. So that's exactly what she did. The Stavik family ate Thanksgiving dinner together, and they were able to catch up on life and just kind of hang out. And I don't know if this happens to everyone or if it's just me, but when I eat Thanksgiving dinner, I always feel super stuffed and bloated and just like overall heavy for the next day. And I'm sure that running would help with this, but if y'all see me running, you better run too because something is chasing me. But Mandy was an avid runner. So the day after Thanksgiving, Mandy had plans later on in the evening to go see a movie with a few of her friends from high school. And she knew that she wouldn't have another chance to go off for a run that day, so Mandy decided between 2 and 3 p.m. to just head out for a run, like she did most every other day. Mandy's mom, Mary, sometimes ran with Mandy, but whether or not Mary ran with Mandy or not, Mandy had always ran the same route in her hometown of Acme before she left for college. And since Mandy was back in Acme for Thanksgiving break, this day was going to be no different. Mandy knew that she wouldn't have time to run at her normal time because she had plans to go to the movies, so she headed out a little early at a little after 2 p.m. And I guess Mandy's mom, Mary, just wasn't feeling up to taking a run that day because she ended up not going. And the route that Mandy would always run was that she would start her run onto Strand Road, which is the road that Mandy's mom's house was on, and she would run down Strand Road until she reached the Nooksack River, and then she'd run back up Strand Road until she made it back to her mom's house. And since Mary wasn't going to be running with Mandy this day, Mandy instead took Kira, the family dog, on the run with her. And Kira was a German Shepherd, so it's not like Mandy was going to be running with a teacup poodle or something. And like I've already said, Mandy left sometime between 2 and 3 p.m., but in most things that I read, it did say that she left for her run a little after 2. So when 4 p.m. rolled around and Mary realized that Mandy still hadn't made it back home from her run, she started to get a little worried. And at about the time that Mary realized that Mandy should have been back for her run by now, Mary opened up the front door to see the family dog Kira standing there. But Mandy wasn't with Kira the dog, which was weird because Mandy would have never just left the family dog like that. But Mandy was an adult now, she was 18 years old, so Mary didn't want to just panic immediately. So instead, Mary started calling around to any of Mandy's friends that she could think of. She called Mandy's boyfriend Rick to see if maybe he had heard from Mandy, but no one had. It was soon after this, though, that Mandy's brother Lee informed Mary that he had seen his sister Mandy running as he was coming down the road, and that where he had seen Mandy at was pretty close to where she would have been, like, coming back from her run at the house at. So he just assumed that she was finishing up her run, but she still hadn't made it back home, though. So why would Mandy do her usual running route and then not return home? Especially when Mandy's brother saw her running, and he said that she was literally almost home, and he also said that she was headed in the direction that she would have been going in order to finish the route that she always ran. So Mandy's brother Lee had literally seen Mandy approaching their house, but it had been hours since then and Mandy still hadn't shown back up from her run, which just did not make any sense. Especially when you consider the fact that the whole reason that Mandy went running when she did is because she had plans for that evening, and because she knew that she wouldn't have time to go on her run if she didn't go on a run earlier than what she normally did. So a few things that are running through my head at this point are: 1, that Mandy wouldn't have made it a point to go for a run earlier than normal if she wasn't planning to make it back home to go to the movies that evening like she'd planned. And secondly, if someone was watching Mandy or possibly even stalking Mandy, this wasn't the usual time that she would have gone out for a run. And Mandy hadn't been in town recently either because she'd been going to college. So where the hell is Mandy? That's actually a good question. And by the end of that evening, this entire tiny town was wondering the exact same thing, and everybody was out searching for Mandy. Mandy's mom, Mary, was a school bus driver in Acme, so she basically knew everyone, and it didn't take long before she had an entire town out searching for Mandy. Mandy had last been seen wearing pink running shoes, light green sweatpants, a light-colored shirt, and listening to music on her Walkman. Now, everyone at this point was just kind of thinking that maybe Mandy was hurt and that she couldn't get herself back home, but after looking through all of those possibilities and all the possible routes that Mandy could have taken, and then after double and triple checking the usual route that Mandy took and the route that her brother had seen her on, there was still no trace of Mandy anywhere. People were taking turns and shifts doing searches, volunteers were out combing through any place that Mandy might be, and the search continued on like this over the entire weekend, because remember, the family had Thanksgiving dinner on Thursday, and then that next day was Friday that Mandy took off for her daily run and never returned. So, luckily, this case was taken seriously right from the jump, and police and volunteers scoured the entire tiny town of Acme all weekend long. The only thing that was found were the sweatpants that Mandy had been wearing when she had last been seen, which is never a good sign. The sweatpants were dirty, they had holes and rips in them, and at first, Mandy's family weren't even sure if the sweatpants belonged to Mandy. But when the police swabbed the sweatpants, there was an unknown sample of semen found. But that sample was practically useless at this point because this was long before CODIS and long before DNA testing was as easy as it is today. But police did try to match the semen sample that was collected, though. They tried to match it to anyone close to Mandy, like her friends, family members, boyfriends, etc., but none of them were a match. And when I say that people were out searching and scouring, I mean that there were helicopters, boaters, bloodhounds, and people walking on foot. And when expert trackers were brought in to see what they could find, the expert trackers were able to find not only Mandy's tracks, but also Kira's tracks, which, if you'll remember, is the family dog. And as these expert trackers tracked and followed both sets of these tracks that they found, it was learned that the dog's tracks and Mandy's tracks both came to a stop at the same place, which kind of seems telling. But at that same place, there was no sign or struggle or anything of that nature. So this immediately sent up the red flag that something nefarious had definitely happened, and this entire tiny town knew Mandy, and she had only been away at college for a few months before she returned home from this Thanksgiving break. So she hadn't even been away at college for that long. All of her high school coaches and all of her family and friends knew that Mandy wasn't the girl that would have just run away on her own. And at this point, there had already been a few things that had been found that definitely seemed to point to the realization that something bad had happened to Mandy. The sweatpants that Mandy had been wearing when she'd left for the run had been found with dirt and holes and semen on them, and the experts had been able to track Mandy's movements during her run when they saw that the tracks of Mandy and the dog Kira had just abruptly stopped in the same spot. Also, the fact that Mandy's brother actually saw her finishing up her run, which she never returned home, which shouldn't have taken very long, especially if she was to the point where she would have been finishing her run to come inside. None of these things point to a good outcome, and I also don't even think that I mentioned that Mandy had brought a friend from college home with her for their Thanksgiving break, so she definitely wouldn't have just taken off and left her friend that she'd brought from college with her there by herself. And then 3 days after Mandy had been reported missing on that Monday, volunteers who were searching the Nooksack River on a boat saw something pink floating in the water up ahead. And once they looked, it was pink running shoes, and they were attached to a body, and the only clothes that were still on the body when the boaters got closer to examine the scene was a pair of socks on the feet. And there was also a tree branch that was almost like holding the body in place. And the body that had been found only wearing a pair of socks was the body of Mandy Stavik. Her body had been found only 6 miles away from her mom's house in the water that was only about knee deep. It was later determined by medical examiners that Mandy had been sexually assaulted, knocked unconscious, and that afterwards she was drowned. But Mandy's official cause of death was listed as a drowning. And at no point in this investigation did police believe that Mandy had drowned in knee-deep water where her body was found. Instead, police were pretty sure that Mandy's body had been put in the water after she was either unconscious or after she was killed. And because of the temperatures of the water being so cold, it had preserved Mandy's body to a point that she didn't even look deceased. Police did immediately expect foul play for a few different reasons. For starters, Mandy was super athletic and an avid runner. Someone would have had to have been in a vehicle when they stopped Mandy, because if her attacker would have been on foot, Mandy would have more than likely been able to outrun them because she was such a good runner. And secondly, Mandy was found completely nude aside from the socks on her feet. Investigators later speculated that Mandy had possibly tried to escape her attacker, and that maybe she had even hidden in some blackberry bushes with thorns all over the bush, because blackberry thorns were found stuck on different parts of Mandy's body also. Police seemed pretty confident that after Mandy had tried to get away from her attacker, that her attacker likely found her, and that's when she was hit on the head and knocked unconscious. Now, an autopsy was done on the day after Mandy's body was discovered, and it was during this autopsy that there was a 3-inch injury on Mandy's head that had been revealed. It had been bleeding internally. But we do already know that this wasn't her cause of death, because her cause of death has been listed as a drowning. Her time of death was also listed at approximately somewhere between 3:30 and 4:30 p.m. And if you remember, Mandy had only left her mom's house to go on this run at about 2 p.m. And she had done that so that she would be able to get her run in before it was too late and it interfered with her plans to go to the movies. Now, another thing that was also discovered during the autopsy was the fact that Mandy had been raped before her death. There was semen found inside of Mandy, and it was able to be determined that it would have had to have been there no more than 12 hours before her time of death. But the public wasn't made aware that Mandy had been raped. Law enforcement were kind of hoping that they would be able to use that piece of information once they had a viable suspect. They did collect a sample of the semen, and they sent it off for analysis so that a DNA profile would be able to be created, which is great. Except for the fact that this is all happening at the very end of 1989. So they do have the DNA, and they are able to create a DNA profile, but that's about as far as the science behind DNA had come at this point. Like I've already said, there wasn't CODIS, there wasn't a national database that you could run the DNA through to get a potential suspect's name, and it just kind of was collected for if and when DNA ever got this far advanced, which luckily we have. Police were pretty much fighting an uphill battle from the very beginning of this investigation after Mandy's body was found. It was pretty clear that where Mandy's body had been found was not actually where she had been killed. It had also rained a ton in the days following Mandy's disappearance, so it's likely that so much potential evidence was washed away by the rain. And since police didn't think that Mandy was killed in the same place where her body was found, that means that police don't have an actual crime scene to go off of. They only have the location of where the body was disposed of. Because police had searched far and wide all around the Nooksack River and the riverbanks, there was no indication of where Mandy had been taken from, and there were no signs or spots that they could find where a potential struggle may have happened. Essentially, they had nothing more than her body and the location where her murderer disposed of her body. But one thing that police were sure of is that Mandy's murderer had to be familiar with this area. He was either from this area, or he knew this area well enough to be able to kind of pass as a local. And everybody in Acme had kind of come to the same conclusion too. There were interviews done with multiple townspeople, and you can just tell that they're wondering how many times they walked past Mandy's killer in the grocery store, or how many times they may have greeted him in the post office, or if they'd ever sat at the table next to Mandy's killer and had dinner with their families. Mandy's murder was on everybody's mind, and people were more aware of their surroundings and more aware and alert of who was around them at all times now than they ever had been before. People were buying guns for protection, people were locking their doors, which is something that a lot of people had never had to worry about in this county and town before. People were warned by law enforcement to be vigilant and to be aware of strangers when you're out in public. Everyone was just living in this perpetual state of fear. But that definitely didn't stop the tips from rolling in. This is actually a case where tips are being called in pretty consistently for the first few weeks and months after Mandy's murder. And one of those tips that seemed to be the most relevant tip was a tip about a man who had been spotted in the same area of where Mandy would have been on her run at around the same day and time that Mandy would have been there. And at this point, everyone's a suspect unless police had been able to rule them out already. And if not, then you were just as good a suspect as anybody else. But the tip about the man who had been in the same area as Mandy on the day of her murder was described as a white man in his early 30s with a quote-unquote pudgy face and cheeks, which, that's rude. But he was also described as having dark hair and a mustache with facial hair growth that would have come from maybe not shaving for 3 or 4 days. So that's a pretty good description. Tipsters who had called in about this pudgy-faced man had also let law enforcement know about the 1970s light brown station wagon that they think this man may have driven. But even with the sketch of this pudgy-faced man being circulated around for the public, and even with the description of this light brown station wagon, this lead went absolutely nowhere. Mandy's funeral was held on December 3rd, 1989 at the St. Joseph's Mission Cemetery, and the local schools in the area had come together to help raise funds to actually pay for Mandy's funeral expenses. There was also a memorial service that was held at the high school that Mandy attended, where more than 1,000 people showed up to say their goodbyes and pay their respects and condolences. Police combed through every lead and every tip, and they were able to rule out tons of people, but that's kind of all they had been able to do was rule people out. They didn't have like an actual suspect to focus their investigation on. The new year passed and months went by with nothing being learned. But then in March of 1990, the sheriff's office announced that they had finally identified a person of interest in Mandy's case. Law enforcement were just waiting on some evidence to verify or rule out this person of interest. But ultimately, this turned out to be nothing that could be used, and it even ended up in a lawsuit being filed against the sheriff's office 2 years later. And in this lawsuit, there were allegations that the person of interest had been held down and forced to give a sample of their DNA so that it could be compared to the DNA collected in Mandy's case. But the sheriff's office denied these claims, and even after this lawsuit fiasco, Mandy's case remained on the back of everybody's mind, but it did eventually grow cold. There were no eyewitnesses, no DNA samples that could be matched to the DNA found on or around Mandy's body at the crime scene, and no new leads. And Mandy's case would remain cold until 2009 when Detective Kevin Boyer, I think, decided that DNA had advanced enough to try to reopen Mandy's case. So in 2009, Detective Kevin was a veteran officer who had many, many years under his belt. But back in 1989, when Mandy was first reported missing and her body was discovered, Detective Kevin was actually a rookie on the force. Which is kind of cool because he ended up being one of the only officers who was able to work this case from the very beginning up until the very, very end. And that is where we're going to have to pick back up next week. I was not expecting to have to cut this episode into 2 parts, like I said, but I've been at the doctor's all week. I've just had so much crap going on. I have maybe the last 15 minutes of this research that needs to be done and typed up, and then it'll be done. So we will pick back up on this case next week. Swear we're going to get back to a normal schedule. I promise. Pinky promise. But until then, let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.